The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold. It was the kind of evening that farmers loved, a moment of peace after a long, hard day of work. James Henderson, a 72-year-old farmer, leaned on his old wooden fence, his eyes scanning the sprawling fields that stretched as far as he could see. This land was more than soil and crops to him. It was his life. Every inch of it had been tilled by his hands. Every blade of grass held a memory. He had worked this farm for over 50 years, pouring his heart into it, fighting droughts, storms, and bad harvests. He had built something out of nothing, and he was proud of that. James was a quiet man. He didn't talk much, but he didn't have to. His silence spoke louder than words. His weathered face, lined with deep wrinkles, told a story of hard work, sacrifice, and survival. His hands, calloused and strong, were a reminder of the endless hours he had spent plowing fields and tending to crops. People in the town respected James, but they also pitied him. He had lived alone for many years, ever since his wife passed away. His son, Marcus, had moved to the city and built a successful career. But James didn't complain. He loved the land and was content with his simple life. The sun's warmth was fading, and a soft breeze carried the smell of freshly cut hay. James took a deep breath, savoring the moment. He had just finished feeding the chickens and was looking forward to sitting on his porch with a cup of tea. But his peaceful evening was about to take a dark turn. Out of nowhere, the sound of an engine roared down the dirt road leading to his farm. James turned his head slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing. A dusty police car came into view, its siren off but its lights flashing. It stopped just outside his gate, and two uniformed officers stepped out. James recognized them immediately. Officer Daniels and Officer Miller. They had a reputation in town, and it wasn't a good one. Daniels was the taller of the two, with a smirk that seemed permanently glued to his face. He walked with a swagger, as if he owned every place he stepped into. Miller, on the other hand, was shorter and stockier. He always followed Daniels' lead, laughing at his jokes and backing him up when things got messy. Together, they were known for pushing people around, especially those who couldn't fight back. James tightened his grip on the fence as the two men approached. He didn't trust them, and he had good reason not to. They had a history of targeting people like him, hard-working, quiet folks who didn't have the means to stand up to their authority. But James wasn't scared. He had faced tougher challenges in his life. "Evening, Mr. Henderson," Daniels said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Nice little place you've got here." James didn't reply. He just stared at them, his face calm but his eyes watchful. He had learned long ago that sometimes saying nothing was the best way to deal with trouble. Daniels chuckled, nudging Miller. "See? I told you he's a man of few words. Must be nice, living out here all quiet and peaceful. But, you know, peace can be a tricky thing to hold onto." James still said nothing. He knew a threat when he heard one, even if it was wrapped in smooth words. Miller stepped forward, a sly grin on his face. "We've been hearing some things, Mr. Henderson. Rumors. About certain folks out here not paying their fair share. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" James' jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel's smirk widened. "Come on now, no need to play dumb. We're just here to help you, stay on the right side of things. You wouldn't want any trouble, would you?" James felt his stomach churn, but he stood his ground. He knew exactly what they were doing. They were fishing for an excuse to squeeze money out of him. They had done it to others in the area, small business owners, farmers, and anyone else they thought couldn't fight back. It was extortion, plain and simple, but they hid behind their badges. "I pay my taxes," James said firmly. "I follow the law." Daniels laughed, but there was no humor in it. Of course, of course. But you see, sometimes folks like us have to step in and remind people of their responsibilities. It'd be a shame if something happened to this nice little farm of yours. Miller nodded, adding, yeah, fires can start so easily out here. And the police can't always get to these rural places in time. You understand, right? James felt anger rising in his chest. How dare they come onto his property and threaten him? But he didn't let it show. Instead, he straightened up, meeting Daniel's gaze head on. If you're here to make accusations, you'd better have proof. Otherwise, you can leave. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Daniel's smirk faltered, and he glanced at Miller. It was clear they hadn't expected James to push back. But they weren't ready to back down, either. Relax, old man, Daniels said, his tone sharper now. We're just doing our job. But maybe we'll take another look around, see if everything's in order. James knew what that meant. They would start poking around, looking for anything they could twist into a problem. But he wasn't about to let them intimidate him. This is private property, he said firmly. Unless you have a warrant, you're not welcome here. Daniels took a step closer, his face hardening. Careful, Mr. Henderson. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. James didn't flinch. He had faced bullies before, nature's storms, economic crashes, and even people who doubted he could make something of his life. These two were no different. But he knew this wasn't a fight he could win with words alone. He needed help, and he needed it fast. I think we're done here, James said, his voice steady but cold. You know the way out. Daniel stared at him for a long moment before finally stepping back. We'll be seeing you, Mr. Henderson, he said with a sneer. Count on it. James watched as they walked back to their car, their laughter fading into the distance. His heart was pounding, but he didn't let it show. He turned and headed back to his house, his mind racing. He needed to make a call, one that could change everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, James stood in his kitchen, holding the phone tightly. The quiet strength he had carried for so long was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, determination. He dialed a familiar number and waited. When the voice on the other end answered, he spoke just 5 words, "Son, I need your help." The afternoon sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long, golden beams across the dry fields. James Henderson stood near his barn, leaning on his pitchfork. His weathered face was calm, but his sharp eyes were locked on the approaching figures. The 2 officers swaggered up the dirt path leading to his property, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust. They walked with an air of arrogance, as if the world belonged to them and they were just stopping by to remind everyone of that fact. Officer Daniels, tall and broad-shouldered, led the way. He wore his uniform like a costume, complete with a smirk that seemed glued to his face. In his hand, he flipped a thick wad of cash like it was a toy. Every now and then, he'd fan the bills out and then fold them back together, all while glancing around James's property with a look of disdain. His partner, Officer Miller, was right behind him. Shorter and heavier, Miller followed Daniels' every move like a loyal dog. He laughed at every sarcastic remark Daniels made, his own face twisted into a cruel grin. The cicadas buzzed loudly in the trees, their rhythmic song filling the otherwise still air. But as the officers got closer, even the insects seemed to quiet down, as if sensing the tension that was about to unfold. Daniels stopped by James's old, rusted pickup truck, leaning against it casually as if it were his own. The metal groaned under his weight, but he didn't care. He tossed the wad of cash in the air once more before catching it, then turned his attention to James. "Let's not make this difficult, old man," Daniels drawled, his tone a mix of fake politeness and cold threat. "You've got a nice setup here. Real peaceful, quiet. Be a shame if something happened to it? James didn't respond. He tightened his grip on the pitchfork, the wooden handle rough under his calloused hands. His jaw clenched, but his face remained steady. Inside, however, anger bubbled like a pot about to boil over. He had heard of Daniels and Miller before, heard the whispers in town about how they operated. They didn't come to protect and serve, they came to take and intimidate. And now, it seemed, they had set their sights on him. Daniels let out a low chuckle, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. Come on, now. Don't give me that look. We're just here to talk. That's all. James still said nothing. He knew men like Daniels thrived on fear. They fed off of weakness, and the moment you gave them an inch, they'd take a mile. So he stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the two intruders. Miller broke the silence, chuckling as he slapped Daniels on the shoulder. I think he's one of those strong, silent types. Probably thinks we'll just leave him alone if he stares us down. Daniels grinned, tilting his head as he looked James up and down. You're not much for conversation, are you, Mr. Henderson? That's okay. We'll do the talking for you. He held up the wad of cash, waving it slightly before tucking it back into his pocket. See this? This is what happens when folks cooperate. Makes things easier for everyone. You understand what I'm saying, don't you? James finally spoke, his voice low and steady. I pay my taxes. I follow the law. I don't owe you anything. Daniels raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. Oh, you follow the law. That's good to hear. But, see, sometimes folks think they're following the law when they're actually bending the rules a little. Maybe cutting a corner here, overlooking something there. And that's where we come in to make sure everything's in order. James didn't reply. He knew exactly what Daniels was doing, trying to bait him, trying to find a crack in his resolve. But James had dealt with tougher challenges than this. He had survived droughts that threatened to destroy his crops, storms that flattened entire sections of his fields, and years of working through back-breaking pain just to keep his farm alive. He wasn't about to let two crooked cops rattle him. Daniels sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. Look, old man, we're trying to help you here. But if you're gonna make this difficult, well, let's just say accidents can happen. Out here in the middle of nowhere, it might take a while for someone to come help you. You understand what I'm saying? Miller chimed in, his grin widening. Yeah, fires are tricky out here. You never know when one might start. And once it does, there's not much you can do to stop it. Real shame. James felt his anger flare, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had seen their kind before, bullies who used their power to scare and control others. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him scared. You're trespassing, James said, his voice firm. Unless you have a warrant, you'd better leave. Daniel's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered, his eyes narrowing. Warrant? Oh, we don't need a warrant to talk, Mr. Henderson. And you're not in a position to make demands. Now, why don't we take a little look around, see if everything's in order here? James stepped forward, planting the pitchfork firmly in the ground in front of him. This is my property, he said. You have no right to be here. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Daniels and Miller exchanged a glance, their smug expression slipping for just a moment. They hadn't expected James to push back. Well, aren't you a feisty one, Daniels finally said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He stepped back, brushing the dust off his uniform. We'll be back, Mr. Henderson. Count on it. With that, the two officers turned and walked back to their car. Miller shot one last smirk over his shoulder before climbing into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life, and the car sped down the dirt road, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. James stood there for a long moment, watching until the car disappeared from view. His heart was pounding, but he didn't let it show. He took a deep breath, gripping the pitchfork tightly as he turned back toward the house. Inside, the phone sat on the kitchen counter, waiting. James picked it up, his hand steady as he dialed a number he hadn't called in a long time. When the line connected, he spoke just 5 words, his voice calm but resolute. "Son, I need your help." The air felt heavier as the officers pushed harder. Daniels, the taller one, leaned in close, his smirk wide and mocking. "Come on, old man. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You've got the money somewhere. Hand it over, and we'll be on our way." James Henderson stood still, his face calm but his hands tightly gripping the pitchfork. His silence only seemed to amuse Daniels more. Miller, the shorter officer, laughed, his voice sharp and unpleasant. "Yeah, we know you're hiding something. Don't make us start looking." James looked at them both, his gaze steady. He knew the truth: he didn't have the money they were demanding. Even if he did, he wouldn't have given it to them. But they weren't the kind of men who listened to reason. Their faces told him everything: they were here to intimidate, to take, to bully. They had done it to others before, and now it was his turn. Daniels took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Listen, we're being nice right now. You don't want us to lose our patience, do you?" James felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He needed a plan. Slowly, he let out a sigh and nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "I'll get the money." Daniels grinned, nudging Miller with his elbow. "See? That wasn't so hard." James turned and began walking toward the house. His steps were slow and steady, his mind racing. He wasn't going to give them a single cent, but he also knew he couldn't handle this on his own. As he entered the house, the screen door creaked behind him, and he made his way to the kitchen. The familiar warmth of the old farmhouse surrounded him, but James didn't stop to appreciate it. His hands reached for the phone on the counter. He hesitated for only a moment before dialing the number he knew by heart. The line rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Marcus Henderson." James took a deep breath. "Son," he said quietly, his voice steady, "I need you to come home. Now." There was silence on the other end of the line. James could almost hear his son's mind racing. Marcus was a man of action, a man who had built a life far from the farm. But James knew he could count on him when it mattered most. "What's wrong, Dad?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp and focused. James didn't give too many details. "I've got 2 officers here. They're trouble. I can't handle this alone." Miles away, in a sleek government office, Marcus froze. His father rarely called, and he never asked for help. For James to reach out like this, it had to be serious. Marcus didn't need to hear any more. He grabbed his badge and gun, his mind already working on a plan. "I'm on my way," Marcus said. "Stay calm. Don't let them know you've called me." James nodded, even though his son couldn't see him. "Hurry." Back at the farm, James returned to the yard. His steps were steady, his face calm, but there was a change in him. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everything he had built, for the life he had worked so hard to protect. Daniels was leaning against James's old truck, flipping a coin in the air. When he saw James, he straightened up, his smirk returning. "Finally cooperating, huh?" he sneered. James didn't respond. His gaze drifted to the distant road, as if waiting for something or someone. Daniels frowned, clearly annoyed by James's silence. "Where's the money?" Daniels demanded, his voice sharper now. James kept his tone calm. "It's coming." Daniels exchanged a glance with Miller, who shrugged. "What do you mean, it's coming? You're wasting our time, old man." James didn't answer. Instead, he leaned on the pitchfork, his eyes still fixed on the road. The quiet confidence in his demeanor seemed to unnerve the officers. Daniels took a step forward, trying to regain control. "Look," Daniels said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "We don't have all day. If you're playing games with us, you're going to regret it." James met his gaze, his expression unchanging. "I've lived through worse than you," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything else James had said. Daniels hesitated, his smirk faltering. Miller shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if expecting someone to appear. The tension grew with each passing second. James didn't move, didn't speak. He was waiting, and the officers could feel it. They didn't know what he was waiting for, but it made them uneasy. "What's going on here?" Miller muttered, his earlier bravado fading. Daniels shook his head, trying to shrug off the feeling of unease. "He's bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. He pointed a finger at James. "You've got 5 minutes to hand over the money. After that, we'll take matters into our own hands." James didn't flinch. He didn't argue or try to explain himself. He just stood there, his eyes unwavering, his silence louder than any words. Far away, Marcus was speeding down the highway, his mind racing as he pieced together what little information his father had given him. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he didn't need to. His instincts as an FBI agent told him everything he needed to know. His father was in trouble, and Marcus wasn't going to let him face it alone. Meanwhile, back at the farm, the tension was building. Daniels and Miller were growing more agitated with every passing moment. They had come expecting an easy payday, but now they were facing something they couldn't quite understand. James's calm demeanor was throwing them off balance, and they didn't like it. "Time's up," Daniels snapped, taking a step closer to James. "Where's the money?" James finally spoke, his voice steady and firm. "It's on its way." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of an approaching car cut him off. The officers turned toward the road, their expressions shifting from irritation to confusion. A sleek black SUV was speeding toward the farm, its dark windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. James allowed himself a small smile. Help had arrived. The sound of tires crunching over the gravel driveway echoed through the farm. Daniels and Miller, who had been growing more impatient by the minute, turned their heads sharply. A sleek black SUV came into view, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sun. The vehicle moved with purpose, its engine rumbling low and steady, like a predator stalking its prey. Daniels squinted, his smirk fading slightly. "Who the hell is this?" he muttered, the confidence in his voice starting to waver. The SUV came to a halt near the barn, and the driver's door swung open. Out stepped a tall, sharply dressed man in a crisp dark suit. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel as he moved with calm authority. He adjusted his tie, and the sunlight caught the badge clipped to his belt, making it gleam brightly. Marcus Henderson had arrived. Daniel's face paled as he took in the sight. This wasn't just some random visitor. This was someone important, someone who didn't belong in their little scheme. He glanced at Miller, who looked just as uneasy. "What's going on here?" Daniels muttered, his voice dropping to a whisper. Marcus didn't answer their questions right away. His dark eyes scanned the scene, taking in every detail: the tense standoff between his father and the two officers, the unease that now hung thick in the air. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of calm control that only made Daniels and Miller more nervous. Without a word, Marcus walked straight past the officers, his steps deliberate and confident. He headed toward his father, who stood near the barn with the pitchfork still in hand. James's face softened as he saw his son, relief washing over him like a wave. Marcus reached him and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You okay, Dad?" Marcus asked softly, his voice low and filled with concern. James nodded, his eyes meeting his son's. "I'm fine now," he replied. There was a quiet strength in his words, but also an unspoken gratitude. He had raised his son to be strong, to stand up for what was right. And now, here he was, doing just that. Marcus turned his attention back to the two officers, his posture shifting slightly. He no longer looked like a son checking on his father. Now, he was all business, every inch the federal agent he had worked so hard to become. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning that carried weight. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Henderson," he said, his tone steady and controlled. "FBI." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Daniel's smirk vanished completely, replaced by a look of pure shock. Miller's eyes went wide, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Marcus took a step closer, his gaze locked on Daniel's. "And you too," he continued, his voice sharp now, "are under investigation." The color drained from Daniel's face. "Investigation," he stammered, his earlier bravado crumbling. "What are you talking about?" Marcus didn't bother answering right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device. He pressed a button, and the unmistakable sound of recorded voices filled the air. It was Daniels and Miller, their threats and demands playing back loud and clear. "Let's not make this difficult, old man," Daniels' voice crackled through the speaker. "It'd be a shame if something happened to this place." Miller's laughter followed. "Yeah, fires can start real easy out here." The officers froze, their faces pale as ghosts. They looked at each other, then back at Marcus, their panic clear. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. They had been caught, and there was no talking their way out of this. "You think you can intimidate people, take their money, and get away with it?" Marcus said, his voice cold and cutting. "Not anymore. Your days of bullying and corruption are over." At that moment, the sound of more engines filled the air. Several black SUVs rolled onto the property, their presence unmistakable. FBI agents poured out, their movements swift and efficient. They surrounded the area, their serious expressions making it clear that this wasn't a game. Daniels raised his hands, his voice trembling as he tried to explain. "This is a misunderstanding. We were just—" "Save it," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "We've been tracking your activities for months. Extortion, abuse of power, and intimidation. You thought you were untouchable, but you were wrong." Miller, who had been silent until now, tried to backpedal. "It was all Daniel's idea. I didn't want to." "Enough," Marcus said sharply, cutting him off. He gestured to the agents nearby. "Take them into custody." The agents moved in quickly, cuffing both officers as they protested weakly. Daniels glared at Marcus, his smirk replaced by a sneer. "You think you've won, Henderson? This isn't over." Marcus met his gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. "It is over. And you have no one to blame but yourself." As the officers were escorted to the waiting vehicles, the tension in the air began to lift. The agents worked efficiently, gathering evidence and documenting the scene. Marcus stayed by his father's side, his presence a quiet reassurance. James watched the scene unfold, his expression a mix of relief and pride. He turned to Marcus, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, son. You didn't have to come all this way." Marcus smiled faintly, his serious demeanor softening. "Of course I did, Dad. You raised me to stand up for what's right. How could I not?" The two men stood together, the farm now filled with the sound of justice being served. The black SUVs, the flashing badges, the agents carrying out their duties, it all felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But for James, it was real. His son had come through for him, just as he always believed he would. As the last of the agents finished their work and the SUVs prepared to leave, Marcus turned to his father. "They won't bother you again," he said. "You're safe now." James nodded, his eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "I know," he said. "And I'm proud of you." The farm fell quiet again as the vehicles disappeared down the road, leaving behind the peace that James had worked so hard to protect. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over the fields. Marcus and James stood side by side, a picture of resilience and strength. Sometimes, James thought, the most powerful help comes not from words, but from actions. And today, his son had